The flickering emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the intake holding area, painting the faces of the other inheritors in ghoulish relief. A power outage of all things. Typical. I adjusted the knot of my tie, a small, unconscious gesture of control in a situation that felt anything but. My name is Blake, and I deal in assets, not anecdotes. I'd spent my career turning liabilities into opportunities, and this latest acquisition, Blackwood Manor, was poised to be my magnum opus, or, at the very least, a significant professional feather in my cap. Mr. Thorne, regarding Blackwood Manor, the paralegal, a nervous young man named Peter, fumbled with a thick file, its pages rustling like dry leaves in the dim light. The conditions of the will are quite specific, and the property itself? He trailed off, glancing around as if the very walls might be listening. I raised an eyebrow. Is there a structural defect not disclosed? Or perhaps a zoning issue I should be aware of? My tone was even, betraying none of the irritation I felt at this theatrical preamble. Peter cleared his throat. No, sir, not exactly. It's just the local history, the stories. I offered a dismissive half-smile. Local history, Peter, is rarely profitable. And stories are for campfire circles, not property deeds. I'm interested in square footage, market value, and potential for development. Blackwood Manor is an estate, isolated, yes, but with considerable acreage. The isolation, which others might find daunting, I saw as a premium. Exclusivity. The drive out was a testament to that isolation. The paved road soon gave way to a gravel track, then little more than a dirt path carved through a dense, ancient-looking forest. The trees pressed in, their branches clawing at the sky, effectively blotting out the last vestiges of the late afternoon light. The air grew heavy, damp with the scent of pine and something else. Something earthy and old. My high beams cut through the encroaching gloom, revealing nothing but more trees, an endless silent wall of green and brown. The GPS had long since lost its signal, but the directions were clear enough. Keep going until the road runs out. And then, it did. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, snaked its way up the walls, reclaiming windows and swallowing entire sections of masonry. The grounds were overgrown, a tangled wilderness of thorny bushes and unkempt trees that seemed to actively resist any attempt at domestication. A sense of profound neglect hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs. No chirping crickets, no distant hum of civilization, just the ticking of the cooling engine. Stepping out of the car, I took a deep, deliberate breath. I wasn't immune to atmosphere, but I refused to let it dictate my perception. This was a property, a challenge, a highly desirable piece of real estate waiting for a visionary. A marketing blip that could be cleverly spun into an aura of exclusivity. The main door, a massive slab of iron-bound oak, groaned open with surprising ease, as if anticipating my arrival. My flashlight beam cut through the Stygian gloom, revealing a vast entrance hall. Dust motes danced in the beam, tiny, ephemeral spirits. I walked further in, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the stone floor. This was it. My opportunity. My legacy. I ran a hand over a dusty newel post, its carved details obscured by years of grime. A shiver, sudden and unbidden, traced its way up my spine. As I surveyed the grand staircase, my gaze drifted to a tall, arched window at its landing. I blinked, focusing. Just the distorted reflection of the overgrown trees outside, perhaps. A trick of the dying light, or the fatigue of a long day. I shook my head, my pragmatism reasserting itself. The house was old, neglected, and undoubtedly full of drafts and settling noises. My professional drive, usually a steady hum, felt strangely amplified here, almost frantic. This place wouldn't defeat me. It would be my greatest triumph. I took another step, and a floorboard directly above me let out a long, drawn-out groan. It wasn't the sharp, sudden crack of an old house settling, but a slow, deliberate sound, like someone shifting their weight. I froze, listening. My hand instinctively tightened around the handle of my briefcase. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. It was just the house, I told myself, settling. Or perhaps a rodent. It was an old house. Old houses made noises. Yet, the distinct feeling of being watched persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I took a deep breath, pushing down the nascent unease. This was a property, a very large, very old, and very neglected property. The opportunity was immense. I would tame Blackwood Manor. I would strip away its legends and reveal its true value. But as I stood there, bathed in the solitary beam of my flashlight, the vast, silent house seemed to breathe around me. A living, waiting presence. Opportunity. The opportunity, as it turned out, was a monumental amount of dust, rot, and sheer physical labor. I attacked the house with a grim determination, stripping away decades of neglect. Days blurred into a rhythm of tearing down, hauling out, and cleaning. The air was thick with plaster dust and the scent of damp wood, a constant reminder of the house's age and my ambition. I started with the kitchen, envisioning a modern, open space. But first, I had to dismantle the past. It was during the demolition of an old pantry tucked away in a corner that the first oddity occurred. I'd set my hammer down on a rickety shelf, turned to wrestle a stubborn piece of lath, and when I looked back, the hammer was gone. Not fallen, not misplaced, simply not there. I scoured the floor, the surrounding shelves, convinced it must have rolled. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my own fatigue, a momentary lapse in attention. I found it an hour later, inexplicably, on a workbench in the living room, a room I hadn't touched since bringing my tools in. Odd, I thought, but again, dismissed it as a trick of memory, a subconscious relocation. This house was huge. My mind was clearly playing tricks. The next few days brought more of these minor dislocations. A measuring tape would vanish, only to reappear in a toolbox I'd already checked 3 times. A specific drill bit would be precisely where I'd left it, only to be gone moments later when I reached for it. Then found tucked into a different compartment in the same box. I started to develop a system, marking where I put things, just to prove I wasn't losing my mind. But the items still shifted. Fleeting peripheral blurs that darted just at the edge of my vision. A flicker in the hallway as I passed. A shape coalescing and dissolving in the corner of a room, too quick to properly register. My head snapped around each time, but there was never anything there. Just the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight, the still, heavy air. I blamed the poor lighting, the grime on the windows, the strain on my eyes from hours of focused work. My brain was clearly overstimulated, manufacturing movement where there was none. They started as an indistinct murmur, like the wind whistling through a poorly sealed window, or the settling creaks of ancient timber. But then, they grew clearer, though never quite coherent. A breathy sigh behind me as I bent to pry up a floorboard. A low, guttural sound, like a throat clearing from the empty room above. I spun around, hammer raised, heart pounding. The house was utterly silent. Just the echo of my own frantic breath. It's settling, the pipes, the draft. I repeated these reassurances like a mantra, trying to anchor myself in logic. I was stressed, overworked, isolated. This was just my mind reacting to the solitude and the sheer scale of the task ahead. But then I started on the walls. I was stripping wallpaper in what would eventually be the master bedroom, pulling away layer after layer of faded floral patterns when I noticed it. The wall itself felt wrong. Not just damp or old, but structurally off. I took a crowbar to it, expecting to find another layer of plaster, perhaps a poorly patched repair. A space behind the plaster, about a foot deep, before another, older wall. It was old, the leather cracked and dry, the pages yellowed. A journal. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it free. I unwrapped the oilcloth, which crumbled at my touch. The journal had no title, just a series of dates scrawled on the first page, starting in the late 1800s. The script was spidery, precise, and immediately unsettling. I flipped to a random page, my eyes scanning the faded ink. It wasn't a family diary in the conventional sense. It detailed architectural observations, strange notes about alignments and thresholds, and repeated references to the hum. One entry, dated 1897, read, "The vibrations are increasing. The wall will not hold it much longer. The angles are shifting. We must reinforce the quiet place before it breaches." My breath hitched. The quiet place? My rational explanations, so carefully constructed, began to crack, crumbling like the old plaster around me. This wasn't just an old house settling. This was something else entirely. And I had just opened a door to it. The words on the page seemed to vibrate with a resonance I couldn't quite grasp. This was not the historical record I'd expected to find. I'd been running on fumes for weeks, pushing myself to categorize and preserve before the true renovation began. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. A faint scent drifted through the air, subtle as a memory. Old roses. Not the dry, papery scent of potpourri, but something fresh, almost dew-kissed, yet with an undercurrent of something lost, something deeply regretted. It was the scent of my grandmother's garden, the one I'd promised to help her tend. I closed my eyes, a pang of familiar guilt twisting in my gut. When I opened them, the scent was gone, replaced by the pervasive must of old dust and damp plaster. Then came the sound, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like a distant, forgotten lullaby. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the very air. I strained my ears, holding my breath. I shook my head, scrubbing a hand over my eyes. Sleep deprivation was a powerful hallucinogen. As I moved to gather my tools, my flashlight beam wavered, catching my reflection in the grimy glass of a window pane. My heart gave a startled thump. I blinked, and the reflection was normal again, just a tired man staring back from a dirty window. A trick of the light, the flickering beam. I scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. My mind was definitely playing games. The power finally flickered back on, a weak, sputtering light, before settling into a steady glow. It was enough. I needed supplies, a hot meal, and a break from the relentless quiet that seemed to press in on me. The general store in town was a relic, smelling of pine cleaner and stale coffee. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and kindness, looked up from behind the counter as I entered. She'd lived in this town her whole life. Everyone knew her. "Blake, dear, you're looking a bit drawn," she observed, her eyes sharp. "Working too hard on that old place?" I forced a smile. "Just trying to get a handle on it, Mrs. Gable." "Oh, it's big all right. And old. Older than most, remember. My grandmother used to tell stories about that house. Said it had a appetite." I chuckled, reaching for a bag of coffee beans. "An appetite? For what, old furniture?" For attention. For sorrow. For things that go missing." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. "It doesn't like to be disturbed, Blake. It doesn't like new owners. They never stay long, you know. Not truly. It finds ways to absorb them." My smile faltered. "Absorb them?" "Into its fabric," she clarified, a strange glint in her eyes. "The house. It takes what it needs, feeds on it. The last owners, the Millers, they went through such a tragedy in there. Lost their little girl. Never saw them truly happy again after that. Just faded away, like ghosts themselves, before they finally left." She shook her head, Be careful, dear. Some places they have a personal touch. And that house, it's a very personal place indeed. I nodded, trying to appear dismissive, though a prickle of unease had begun to spread across my skin. I appreciate the warning, Mrs., but I'm just restoring it, not disturbing anything. I'm sure it'll be fine. I paid for my items, eager to leave, to escape the weight of her words. Superstitious old-timer, I told myself, just local folklore. Gable's words echoed in my mind, an irritating drone I couldn't shake. Appetite absorbs them, a very personal place. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, cataloging a stack of dusty ledgers. Just an old house, Blake, bricks and mortar. The distant hum returned, louder this time, a mournful chord that seemed to resonate with the lingering guilt about my grandmother, about the miller's lost child. Gone as soon as I turned my head. My heart hammered. Just exhaustion. But the house seemed to sigh around me, a deep, resonant sound, as if it had just taken a long, satisfying breath. It was already beginning to feed. Exhaustion, I told myself, clutching the ledger tightly. I tried the door, the one I'd come through. Locked. I rattled the handle, then pounded on the heavy wood. This wasn't right. I tried the small, grimy window set high in the wall, half expecting it to be barred. It was, but loosely. Something metallic, like old blood. I pushed, but the frame was rusted shut. Hello? My voice was a croak, thin and reedy. Is anyone there? Only the house answered, its deep hum seeming to intensify, a low thrum against my eardrums. I had to get out. My car. I could drive out of here. I passed doors that I swore weren't there before, or doors that should have been open now stood firmly shut. A familiar hallway I remembered from earlier, leading to what I thought was the service exit, now ended abruptly in a blank, plastered wall. I ran my hand over it, feeling the rough texture, utterly bewildered. It was as if the very architecture of the place was shifting, mocking my sense of direction. Finally, after what felt like an hour of disoriented wandering, I found a door that led outside. Hope surged, a desperate, fleeting thing. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. The engine turned over once, coughed, then died. I tried again and again. I got out, shining my light on the tires. All four were flat, slashed with brutal precision. Not just deflated, but torn. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a power outage. I was trapped. I stared out at the narrow, winding road that led back to civilization. It was barely visible in the faint moonlight. I could walk. It couldn't be that far. I started down the gravel drive, my steps hurried, the ledger still clutched under my arm. But as I rounded the first bend, my light caught something in the distance. A massive oak, uprooted, its gnarled branches stretching like grasping claws, lay sprawled across the entire width of the road. Another tree, equally huge, had fallen beside it, creating an impenetrable barrier. No way through, no way around. The reality hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was utterly, completely isolated. The house had done this. It had orchestrated my capture. You should have listened, Blake. The voice was old, gravelly, familiar. The hair on my arms stood on end. I pushed open the door, retreating into the safety of the house, though I knew it was no refuge. I moved through the familiar yet unfamiliar corridors, my mind reeling. My sanity felt like a thread fraying in a storm. Blake, you always were too curious for your own good. That was him, the old man, my mentor. His face now shimmering at the edge of my vision. His eyes filled with a weary disappointment. He was standing in the intake holding area, just as I'd found him in the ledger, but younger, vibrant, looking directly at me. Some things are best left buried. He gestured toward the ledger in my hand, his spectral finger almost touching the cover. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head violently. No, you're not real. When I opened them, the old man was gone, replaced by a younger woman, her face etched with a pain so profound it twisted my gut. She was in a different room, a child's nursery, rocking an empty cradle, tears streaming down her face. Her voice, thin and reedy, pierced through the hum of the house. "He's gone, Blake, because of you." My breath hitched. The memory was a shard of glass in my mind, a wound that had never truly healed. Was this what the house wanted? To strip me bare? To force me to confront every ghost I'd ever tried to outrun? The air grew heavy, thick with unseen presences. I could hear faint, disembodied footsteps above me, the creak of old floorboards where no one could possibly be. The walls seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding, the very fabric of reality stretching thin, not just physically, but mentally. The house wasn't just isolating me, it was dismantling me, piece by agonizing piece. The power outage had plunged the intake holding area into a suffocating blackness, broken only by the anemic beam of my phone's flashlight, its battery icon a grim reaper's scythe. I clutched the tattered journal, its brittle pages an anchor in the swirling chaos of my mind. My fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled to the section I'd skimmed earlier, a hurried glance that hadn't prepared me for the truth. The faint light danced across the cramped, frantic handwriting, a testament to mind's unraveling. Entries from a Mrs. Played on repeat. A Mr. Silas Croft wrote of the weight of my failures, how the house magnified every wrong turn, every slight, until I could feel them pressing down, suffocating me. His final entry was just a single sprawling word: forgive. These weren't just the ramblings of madmen. These were confessions, amplified. The house wasn't merely a place of isolation. It was a predator. It didn't just contain despair, it cultivated it. It fed. Not just fear, though that was a potent spice, but something far more insidious. Regret. Unresolved guilt. It wasn't just echoing past tragedies. It was actively seeking out the deepest wounds of its inhabitants, tearing them open and feasting on the agony. It had been dissecting me, probing my defenses, finding the raw nerves of my own past mistakes. And then, the manifestations began. The air in the holding area grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. A faint greenish luminescence bloomed in the corner, coalescing into a form. It was her. Sarah. Her face etched with the same hurt I remembered from that last terrible argument. Her eyes, wide and accusing, locked onto mine. "You promised you'd be there. You left me." My breath hitched. It wasn't an echo. It was Sarah, vivid and real, her phantom hand reaching out, not to touch, but to point an accusing finger straight at my chest, where the guilt had festered for years. I had chosen my career over her, over us, at a critical moment in her life. I had rationalized it, but the truth was, I'd abandoned her. The house knew. It had pulled that memory, that specific agonizing regret, from the depths of my soul and given it form. The spectral image of Sarah flickered, then dissolved, only for another to take its place. This time, it was my father, his face gaunt, his hospital gown hanging loosely. But this wasn't him as I last saw him. This was him from years before, when I'd ignored his calls, too wrapped up in my own youthful pursuits. Not until it was too late. He faded, replaced by the silent, judging stare of my younger self, standing over a broken toy, a forgotten promise to a sibling. The manifestations came faster, overlapping, a tormenting kaleidoscope of my greatest failures, my deepest shames. The house wasn't just showing me these things. It was making me feel them again. The raw, visceral pang of each regret, amplified 1,000-fold. A desperate surge of defiance coursed through me. I wouldn't be another name in a tattered journal. I wouldn't let it feed. I found a loose floorboard, pried it up with frantic fingers, then another. The intake holding area had a heavy, solid door, but the windows were old, their panes rattling. If the house fed on what was inside me, I needed to shut it out, or at least shut myself in. I began to board up the door, then the windows, working with a frantic, animalistic energy. I used the broken leg of a chair, shards of the floorboards, anything I could find. The splintered wood groaned as I jammed it against the frame, driven by a primal need to erect a barrier, to physically reject the house's insidious penetration. Each bang of wood against wood was a scream of defiance against the encroaching madness. But the house merely watched, or rather, it felt. As I hammered the final makeshift board across the small barred window, a low guttural growl rumbled through the very foundations. The boards I had just secured began to shudder, not from my efforts, but from something emanating from within the walls themselves. The boards groaned, splintered, and then, with a sharp crack, pulled inward, tearing free from the frame. It pulsed with a malevolent, hungry energy, surrounding me, pressing in. The house wasn't just adapting, it was retaliating, turning my very attempts at defense into a new, more potent form of torment. It wanted me to know that there was no escape, no barricade strong enough to keep out the truth of my own damned soul. The door, which I had so painstakingly barricaded, suddenly shuddered violently. Not flung open, not forced, but pulled, as if by an unseen, deliberate hand. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid like old blood and dust. Then the walls began to ripple. The dull, institutional gray paint peeled back, not in strips, but dissolving into a swirling vortex of blueprints and schematics. Lines of architectural drawings, familiar and horrifying, writhed across the surfaces, depicting skeletal girders, crumbling concrete, and the ghost of a vast open space. The intake area was gone, replaced by an illusion of a grand atrium, its ceiling already fractured, its support beams groaning under immense, unseen pressure. A murmur began, faint at first, like a distant crowd. It grew, swelling into a cacophony of excited chatter, then a sudden collective gasp, and finally, a chorus of agonizing screams that tore through the phantom space. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound penetrated, vibrating in my bones, echoing the very real screams that had haunted my nightmares for years. Not again. Please, not again. But the house was merciless. It dragged me back, not just in memory, but in horrifying, vivid hallucination. The Blake Project, my magnum opus, the community center designed to be a beacon of hope, a hub of connection, a testament to modern, sustainable architecture. My dream, my hubris. I saw myself, younger, brimming with a dangerous blend of talent and arrogance, oblivious to the cracks already forming beneath the gleaming surface of my ambition. I heard the congratulatory speeches, the joyous laughter of families gathered for the grand opening. The ribbon was cut, a flash of red against the pristine white marble. Cheers erupted. Then, the first crack. A hairline fracture in the main support beam, dismissed as a cosmetic flaw during a hurried final inspection. The tremor that followed, subtle but unmistakable, like the earth itself sighing in resignation. The slow, agonizing groan, deep within the structure, a sound only I seemed to hear, a sound that now resonated through the very walls of this cursed house. The house showed me every fatal flaw, every corner I'd allowed to be cut for budget reasons, every warning from junior engineers I'd dismissed as overcautious. It played back the moments I'd chosen aesthetics over absolute safety, the subtle shifts in the design that had, in hindsight, sealed its doom. The grand atrium began to buckle. Dust, thick and choking, billowed from the ceiling. A section of the roof gave way, not with a bang, but with a sickening, drawn-out groan of tearing metal and pulverizing concrete. The screams intensified, raw and primal, as people scattered, only to be caught in the cascading debris. The smell of ozone and burning dust filled my lungs, making me gag. I fell to my knees, burying my face in my hands, but the images burned behind my eyelids. The faces of the bereaved, their eyes accusing, their grief a bottomless pit I had dug. The weight of it all, the crushing, insurmountable burden of my guilt settled on my shoulders, heavier than any concrete slab. It was my fault, I wept, the words tearing from my throat, raw and hoarse. All my fault, every last one. The house pressed down, a malevolent entity feeding on my despair. It wasn't merely showing me the past. It was forcing me to relive it, to feel the shame, the horror, the responsibility for every shattered life, magnified 1,000-fold. I was suffocating, my breath hitching, my lungs burning. There was no escape, no corner of my mind it couldn't penetrate. They swirled, circling me, their silent condemnation more piercing than any scream. I was broken, utterly, irrevocably broken. I wanted it to end. I wanted to disappear, to cease to exist, to finally be free of the torment. As I writhed, my hands scraped against something. Not the rough concrete, but something smoother, older wood. A flicker of something. Not hope, but a desperate animalistic instinct to escape the immediate crushing torment. Pierced through my despair. My fingers found a seam, a loose floorboard. I pushed, and with a soft click, it shifted, revealing a cleverly concealed latch. With trembling hands, I worked the latch, pulling the heavy plank aside. I fumbled for my phone, which I dropped in my agony. Its weak beam cut through the gloom, revealing a bound leather journal nestled within the recess. It was old, the leather cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed. My fingers traced the faded script on the first page. Elias Vance. And then a date. October 1888. I flipped through, my heart beginning to thrum with a different kind of fear now, one laced with an unsettling curiosity. The pages were filled with intricate architectural sketches, not of the community center, but unmistakably of this very house. Detailed elevations, strange symbols etched into the margins, cryptic notes about grounded sorrow and living structures. Then a meticulous family tree, drawn with a precise, almost obsessive hand. At the top, Elias Vance, and further down, a branch leading to me, Blake, my ancestor. A passage, scrawled in a frantic hand, seemed to leap from the page. The earth here is not merely earth. It remembers. It hungers. I built upon its weeping, and now it weeps through my walls. A monument to my own failures, my own despair, for what else could hold the weight of such sorrow? It is built to endure, to suffer, to remember. It will feed. This house wasn't just old. It was born of sorrow, built by sorrow for sorrow. The house wasn't merely attacking me. It was calling to its kin, recognizing the same brokenness in me that had birthed it. It was feeding, and it had been waiting for me. Something had shifted inside me. The sorrow that had birthed this house. The sorrow that had woven itself into my own bloodline, my own architectural failures. It was still a crushing weight. But now, it felt like a challenge. I was no longer just a victim waiting for the next horror. I was a prisoner, yes, but one with a mind, an architect's mind, and a desperate need to survive. This house wasn't just old. It was an entity, a living, breathing monument to grief. But even living things had weaknesses. Even the most formidable structures had stress points, hidden passages, forgotten service tunnels. My trauma was a raw wound, but it was also a crucible, hardening my resolve. I had to find an exit. Not just a way out, but the way out, the flaw in its design, the chink in its sorrow-forged armor. I began my systematic search. My phone's beam cut through the gloom, painting fleeting patterns on the walls. The intake area I remembered from my brief, terrifying arrival was meant to be a transient space, a reception. Surely it would have connections, egress points. My architectural training, usually a source of pride, now felt like a desperate, almost pathetic tool against something so utterly irrational. I looked for lintels, for sills, for the telltale lines of a doorframe painted over, for the subtle changes in plaster texture that indicated an old opening. I knelt, examining the floorboards, searching for trapdoors, for any sign of a concealed mechanism. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, and something sweet, like decaying flowers. But the house fought back. It wasn't passive. As I moved, scrutinizing a section of wall near what should have been a service closet, I heard a faint, grinding sigh. The wall, a moment ago solid, seemed to ripple. My light flickered across a seam that hadn't been there before, then vanished, swallowed by the seamless plaster. I tapped it again. Solid. Unyielding. But I knew what I had seen. I moved to what I remembered as the main entrance, the massive oak-paneled double doors. I pushed, pulled, examined the hinges, the lock. They were sealed, as if they had been bricked up from the other side. My frustration began to mount, a hot, bitter taste in my mouth. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beat of my heart. This wasn't a normal structure. Its rules were its own. I pressed on, exploring the periphery of the intake area, a short, featureless corridor that seemed to lead nowhere. It ended abruptly in a blank wall, where my memory insisted there had been an archway leading to another wing. I traced the wall with my fingers, my light beam dancing. That's when I saw it. Not immediately, but after several passes, a faint, almost imperceptible discoloration. A thin, vertical line that seemed to shimmer under the light. It was an old inscription, barely visible, etched into the plaster itself, then painted over countless times, only to bleed through the layers like a persistent stain. I knelt, holding my phone closer, squinting, trying to decipher the faded script. It was Latin, archaic, almost poetic. My knowledge was rusty, but enough to grasp fragments. Sanguis vitae, victus tenebris, fames, blood of life, hunger. My breath hitched. Hunger. This house had a hunger. On sorrow, yes, but perhaps on something more tangible, something that could be withheld. I ran my finger over the next line, even more faint, almost a phantom. Privar, exsicar, finem, to deprive, to dry out. The end. This wasn't just a place to endure. It was a parasitic entity. And parasites could be starved. They could be deprived of their sustenance. The house didn't just exist. It consumed. If I could understand what it consumed, I could find a way to cut off its supply. A desperate, wild hope ignited within me. It was about finding the house's pantry, its larder, its source of life. My architectural training, my understanding of systems and flows, suddenly had a new, terrifying purpose. I wasn't just seeking an exit. I was seeking a weapon. I was going to starve this house until it withered and died, or until it opened its maw and spat me out. The sorrow it had feasted on, the sorrow in my own bloodline, would become its poison. This wasn't about finding a door or a hidden passage anymore, not in the traditional sense. The house wasn't a physical trap. It was a psychological crucible, designed to burn away everything but the raw, unadulterated essence of my guilt and despair. The single flickering emergency light hummed, casting long, distorted versions of the past onto the grimy walls. The first to appear was not a stranger, but a face I knew intimately from my recurring nightmares. It was an old friend, blurred at the edges like a forgotten photograph, but his eyes were sharp, accusing. When I needed you most, you chose convenience. My heart seized. It was true. I'd made a choice years ago, a selfish one that had caused him significant harm, driven by my own fear and ambition. I'd rationalized it, buried it, but the memory had always been a splinter under my skin. I braced myself, expecting the usual surge of panic, the frantic search for an escape. But this time, something was different. The hope, grim and resolute, held firm. Yes, I said, my voice hoarse, the admission tearing at my throat. I did. I was a coward. I was selfish. I chose convenience over loyalty. Flickered, its accusing eyes widening slightly, a hint of surprise. It didn't vanish, but its presence felt less solid, less overwhelming. The house, I realized, fed on my resistance, on my denial. My acceptance was poison to it. But the house was not so easily defeated. As the first figure wavered, another coalesced beside it, and then another. A woman I'd hurt with careless words, her face etched with the pain I'd inflicted. A mentor I'd betrayed, his expression a mask of profound disappointment. Each one a living, breathing testament to a mistake, a wrong turn, a moment of weakness I'd tried to forget. You promised. You broke her heart. You ran. You took the easy way out. The air grew heavy, thick with their accusations, pressing down on me like the weight of 1,000 years of regret. My breath hitched, tears blurring my vision. This was the true horror, not the physical confinement, but the internal prison I'd built for myself, now exposed and populated by the very ghosts I'd created. This was harder than any physical struggle. It was an excavation of my soul, digging through layers of self-deception and rationalization to unearth the raw, ugly truth beneath. Each memory was a stab, each admission a self-inflicted wound. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to run from these specters. But where could I go? They were me. They were parts of my story. I'm sorry, I choked out, the words ripped from my chest, not to them, but to the ghosts of my own conscience. I'm so sorry for what I did to you and to myself. I regret it. Every day. The woman's face softened, just for a fleeting moment, before she too began to fade, her form losing definition like smoke in a breeze. The mentor's disappointment lessened, his spectral eyes losing their sharp edge. They became less a chorus of condemnation and more a distant echo, a reminder rather than an attack. I forced myself to look at each apparition, to remember the specific mistake, the pain I'd caused, I'd been. There was I'd undermined for a promotion, his spectral face now devoid of anger, merely showing the weary resignation of someone who'd been wronged. Blindly so. I used you for my own gain. He vanished. The figures were still there, many of them, a swirling vortex of my past. But as I confronted each one, not with defense or denial, but with the painful, unvarnished truth of my actions, their power waned. Their forms became translucent, their voices faint. It was a battle, not against a monster, but against myself. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was fighting back, not by running, but by standing my ground and facing the horrors within. I was bleeding, but I was also healing, one agonizing regret at a time. The house could bring forth every ghost I had, but it couldn't force me to deny them anymore. I would accept them all. The swirling vortex of my past finally began to recede, not because I fought it, but because I embraced the agony it brought. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of dust and decay and something else, a metallic tang that prickled my tongue, casting a sickly green glow. I held it up, the beam trembling in my unsteady hand, and saw the room I was in. It was small, windowless, and the ceiling was impossibly low, pressing down like a tomb lid. Rough, Unfinished stone walls, slick with condensation, closed in on me. There were no shelves, no furniture, just a single heavy wooden door, long since warped and splintered, hanging ajar on rusted hinges. This wasn't a room I'd ever seen before, yet a primal instinct screamed that this was it. The intake holding area. A place where things were brought in, processed, and then, inevitably, consumed. A low, guttural thrum vibrated through the floor, a sound I felt more than heard, deep in my bones. It was the house's heartbeat, slow and ancient and malicious. The sound pulled me forward, drawing me to the far wall. As my phone's failing light swept across it, I saw it. It wasn't a crack or a hidden panel, but a grotesque, organic growth. From the rough stone, a mass of gnarled, obsidian-black roots had erupted, twisting and interweaving like the veins of some titanic, petrified heart. They had consumed a section of the wall, spreading like a cancerous bloom, and at their very center, where the roots converged into a single massive trunk, was the source. Embedded deep within the roots, almost swallowed by them, was a heavy, tarnished iron grate. It wasn't a grate for ventilation or a drain. It was a cage, forged from iron so old it seemed to drink the light, crisscrossed with symbols I couldn't decipher but felt in my soul were ancient and terrible. This was the core, the festering heart of the house's malice, a reservoir of all the despair, the fear, the suffering it had ever ingested. My mind, now strangely clear from its earlier torment, understood with horrifying clarity. This wasn't merely an artifact, it was a wound, a conduit. The house didn't have a malevolent spirit. It was one, and this was its nexus, its umbilical cord to the world. It drew sustenance from the pain of those within its walls, feeding on their despair, growing stronger with each passing moment of fear. To sever this connection, to stop the house from feeding, I couldn't just destroy the physical manifestation. That would be like cutting off a limb. The core would simply regenerate or find another way. I had to starve it. I had to cut off its sustenance, not from the outside, but from the inside. You are its food. You are what it craves. To defeat it, I had to offer it something it couldn't consume, something that would choke it, poison it. I had to offer it my hope, my will to live, my desire for a future beyond these walls, every shred of light I possessed. Only then, by giving it something it couldn't digest, something that was anathema to its nature, could I hope to destroy it. As this understanding solidified, the house reacted. The low thrum intensified, becoming a frantic, angry beat. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing down on me. From the tar-like substance behind the grate, something began to stir. A faint, sickeningly sweet stench filled my nostrils, like decaying flowers and old blood. The bubbling intensified, and then, from the swirling depths, a form began to coalesce. It was amorphous, shifting, but undeniably growing, reaching. It wasn't a ghost, not a memory, but a concentrated mass of the house's pure, undiluted malice manifesting itself. It writhed, a silent scream of fury and desperation, knowing what I intended. It was the ultimate confrontation, not with a physical being, but with the very embodiment of the house's hunger, its ancient, unyielding evil. And to win, I had to give it everything. Now I would face my future and willingly extinguish it, if that was the only way to end this nightmare. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the dust and decay, and prepared to offer my ultimate sacrifice. The intake holding area, usually a stark, utilitarian space, felt like the maw of a beast. The house's core, or at least a major artery leading directly to it. My plan was simple, suicidal, and born of pure desperation. I would sever that artery. It looked like any other concrete slab, but I knew better. Beneath its surface, something ancient and vile thrummed. I had found a heavy, rusted rebar in a forgotten storage closet, my crude, defiant weapon. With a guttural roar, more animal than human, I swung the rebar, aiming for the pulsating center. The impact was jarring, a sickening crunch that resonated not just through the metal, but deep in my bones. The wall cracked, and a viscous black fluid, thick as crude oil, began to ooze from the fissure, hissing as it met the cool air. The house screamed. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but a psychic shriek that tore through the very fabric of my mind, 1,000 agonized voices rising in unison. For a terrifying moment, I was blind, deafened by the internal scream, utterly lost. The concrete floor beneath my feet liquefied, turning into a churning black mire that pulled at my boots. I stumbled, fighting for purchase as the walls around me rippled, stretching and twisting like tortured flesh. Shapes began to coalesce in the gloom. The faint, sickly sweet scent of the old, decaying wood filled my nostrils, and I heard the distant, mocking laughter of children who had never truly accepted me. Always have been. The floor buckled again, and I plunged downwards, landing hard on something that felt like jagged, shattered glass. Pain flared in my side, a searing agony that made me gasp. I pushed myself up, my vision blurring, and saw my own reflection in the shards, distorted and monstrous, eyes wide with fear. The labyrinth shifted again. Now I was in a narrow, claustrophobic tunnel, the walls pressing in, threatening to crush me. The air grew thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the coppery scent of fear. My own fear. My deepest, most primal fear. Being trapped, helpless, consumed. They had no faces, but their forms were vaguely familiar. Outlines of people I had failed, people I couldn't save. They reached for me with spectral hands, their touch an icy burn that seeped into my soul. You weren't strong enough. You never are. I roared, a raw, desperate sound, and swung the rebar wildly, the rusted metal tearing through the illusory figures with a sickening, silent rip. Each swing was a monumental effort, my muscles screaming in protest. My side throbbed, a hot, wet sensation spreading across my shirt. I knew I was bleeding, but the pain was a dull counterpoint to the psychological torment. The tunnel began to constrict further, the ceiling lowering, the walls closing in. I had to crawl now, dragging myself forward, the rebar clutched tight. The weight of the house, of my own fears, pressed down on me, threatening to flatten me into oblivion. What was the point? This house was endless, its power absolute. I was just one man, broken and bleeding. My greatest failure. The house amplified it, twisting the image into a grotesque tableau, the air thick with the smell of lilies and damp earth. "Give up, Blake," the house hissed, its voice now a singular, dominant entity, 1,000 voices merging into one crushing command. Let go. Embrace the peace of oblivion. My vision swam. My lungs burned. My arm, where a deep gash wept crimson, felt like dead weight. They were pulling me down, into the black mire beneath, into the ultimate surrender. But then, a flicker. I had faced my past, my pain. I had chosen this. I had chosen to fight. Not yet. With a superhuman surge of will, I forced my arm up, the rebar shaking in my grip. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the house's core, its malevolent heartbeat pulsating faintly even through the illusion. It was still there, somewhere beneath the shifting nightmare. I had to find it. I had to hit it again. One more time. Even if it killed me. Especially if it killed me. With a final desperate roar that tore my throat, I plunged the rebar down. There was no sound of metal striking stone, no crunch of splintering wood. Instead, a shriek ripped through the air. A sound that wasn't sound, but pure agony. It was the house itself, screaming. The rebar met something yielding, yet impossibly dense, like driving a stake into a living ancient tree. A wave of pure psychic feedback slammed into me, a torrent of rage and pain and despair that threatened to shatter my very soul. I tasted bile. My vision flared white, then black, then a dizzying kaleidoscope of the house's countless victims, their faces flickering like dying embers. The rebar vibrated violently in my hand, as if trying to tear itself free. I held on, knuckles white, teeth gritted, pouring every last ounce of my will into the strike. The entire intake holding area bucked and groaned, the floor cracking beneath my feet. Dust and debris rained down, a shower of plaster and splintered wood. Then, just as suddenly, it began to recede. The screams faded into a ragged gasp. The grinding tremors softened to a shudder. I could dimly make out the outlines of the collapsed lockers, the overturned desk, the flickering red glow of the emergency exit sign that had been swallowed by the gloom for so long. I stood there, panting, the rebar still clutched in my hand, its tip now strangely inert, no longer humming with malevolence. My arms were shaking uncontrollably, my entire body screaming in protest. I felt like I'd been pulled through a meat grinder, every muscle torn, every bone bruised. But I was alive, and the house was quiet. It felt like holding my breath in a crypt, waiting for the lid to slam shut. I stumbled backwards, dropping the rebar with a clang that echoed too loudly in the sudden stillness. My legs were like jelly, threatening to give out beneath me. I pushed myself upright, leaning heavily against a jagged piece of wall, my eyes scanning the wreckage. The intake area was a ruin. The ceiling had partially caved in, exposing twisted pipes and a gaping hole to the floor above. Rubble lay everywhere, a fresh landscape of destruction. The air, though thick with dust, felt lighter, less poisoned. Each step was an agony. My right leg dragged, a searing pain shooting through my knee. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. I pushed through the debris, scrambling over overturned furniture, my hands raw from clutching at rough surfaces. The emergency exit, still glowing a weak red, was partially blocked by a fallen beam. I shoved against it with my shoulder, grunting with effort, until it groaned and shifted just enough for me to squeeze through the narrow gap. I stumbled out onto the cracked asphalt of the old parking lot, gasping for breath, my eyes watering from the dust and the sudden change in light. The streetlights were still out, but the moon, previously obscured by the house's pervasive gloom, was now a pale, indifferent disk in the sky. And there it stood. The house. It was still there, a monstrous silhouette against the bruised sky. But it was different. A gaping maw had been torn into its side, where the intake area used to be. The roof sagged in places, a few windows were shattered, and deep spiderweb cracks marred its once impenetrable facade. It looked wounded, broken, but not dead. The house stood, silent, inert, a monument to its own suffering and the suffering it had inflicted. The malevolence was no longer actively radiating, no longer a tangible force pressing down on me. But I could still feel it, a faint, residual hum in the air. A deep, dormant power waiting. I had survived. I looked at my hands, streaked with grime and what felt like the essence of the house. And a piece of it, I knew, had stared back into mine, and stayed. My past, my trauma, the house's horror. It was all tangled together now, a Gordian knot within my soul. I was profoundly changed, scarred in ways that went deeper than the cuts and bruises on my skin. The fear wasn't gone. It had simply shifted, become internalized. I was free, yes, but forever marked. The house stood behind me, a silent, wounded beast. They just sleep and wait.